They called Private Zara Blackthorne just another fragile recruit who couldn't handle real combat. But when insurgents ambushed her unit in the treacherous mountains of Kandohar Province, leaving her squad leader bleeding out with a shattered spine, she was about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes carry the greatest strength, literally carrying Staff Sergeant Rodriguez 2 miles through hostile territory that would test even the most elite soldiers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Meet Private Zara Blackthorne, barely 22 years old, standing just 5'2", with a deceptively slight frame that made seasoned drill instructors shake their heads in concern. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in regulation braids, revealing a face that seemed better suited for a college campus than a battlefield. Bright green eyes that appeared almost too gentle for military life, and hands that looked like they'd be more comfortable holding textbooks than assault rifles. When she'd first arrived at Forward Operating Base Thunderclap in the rugged Kandohar Mountains 8 months ago, the whispers had started immediately. "She won't last a week out here," muttered Corporal Jake Hastings, watching her struggle with her oversized equipment. "Command's gotta be kidding, sending us someone who looks like she belongs in a library, not a war zone." The doubts weren't entirely unfair. Zara stood out like a sore thumb among the battle-hardened soldiers of Delta Company's 3rd Platoon. While her male counterparts averaged 180 pounds of muscle and attitude, Zara barely broke 115 pounds soaking wet. During their first training exercise in the harsh mountain terrain, she'd fallen behind on a routine 5-mile march, gasping for breath while carrying the standard 60-pound pack that seemed to dwarf her entire body. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the base commander, had pulled her aside after that disastrous first week. "Blackthorne, I'm going to be straight with you. This isn't some equality experiment. Out here, if you can't keep up, people die. Your squad mates are already talking about requesting transfers. We don't trust you to have their backs." But Zara had something that her critics couldn't see, something that didn't show up in her personnel file or her unimpressive physical training scores. When Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, her squad leader, had asked why she'd enlisted, she'd given him the standard answer about serving her country. What she hadn't told him was the real reason she'd walked away from her full scholarship to Stanford University, abandoning a promising future that everyone expected her to pursue. For 8 months, Zara had endured the constant stream of doubt and barely concealed contempt from her fellow soldiers. They called her Pixie behind her back, a nickname that stung more than any direct insult. During combat drills, she was consistently the slowest, the weakest, the one who needed help with equipment that others handled effortlessly. Her shooting scars were adequate, but nothing special. Her tactical knowledge was solid but unremarkable. By every measurable standard, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a small, fragile young woman who had somehow convinced military recruiters to let her play soldier. The morning of September 15th started like any other patrol day in the unforgiving Kandohar Mountains. Delta Company's 3rd Platoon was conducting a routine reconnaissance mission along a supply route that had seen increased insurgent activity. The terrain was brutal rocky paths that wound through narrow canyon passages with elevation changes that left even experienced soldiers winded. Zara was, as usual, bringing up the rear of the formation, her smaller stride requiring extra effort to keep pace with the 7 other members of her squad. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had positioned himself near the middle of the formation, where he could maintain visual contact with both the point man and the rear guard. At 34 years old and 200 pounds of solid muscle, Rodriguez was everything a squad leader should be: experienced, decisive, and physically imposing. He'd served 3 tours in various combat zones and had the respect of every soldier under his command, while almost every soldier Rodriguez had been one of the few who'd given Zara a fair chance, though even he harbored private doubts about her ability to perform under real combat pressure. "Stay alert, people." Rodriguez's voice crackled through their radio headsets as they navigated a particularly narrow section of the mountain path. "Intelligence reports suggest this area has been used for supply drops to insurgent forces. We could be walking into anything." The words had barely left his mouth when the world exploded into chaos. The insurgents had chosen their ambush site perfectly, a narrow ravine, where the squad would be forced into a single-file formation with limited options for cover or escape. The first explosion came from an improvised explosive device buried in the path ahead, followed immediately by automatic weapons fire from elevated positions on both sides of the ravine. In the space of 3 seconds, Rodriguez went from squad leader giving tactical warnings to a man fighting for his life. Shrapnel from the IED had torn through his lower back, and when he dove for cover behind a boulder, a sniper's bullet had found its mark, shattering 2 vertebrae and leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Blood was pooling beneath him at an alarming rate, and his radio calls for support were growing weaker by the minute. "Man down! Man down!" Corporal Hastings was screaming into his radio while returning fire at muzzle flashes from the ridgeline above. "Rodriguez is hit bad. We need immediate medical evacuation." But as the firefight intensified, it became clear that medical evacuation wasn't coming anytime soon. The insurgents had chosen their position to cut off easy access for rescue helicopters, and the rough terrain made vehicle evacuation impossible. Rodriguez was bleeding out in a hostile environment, 2 miles from the nearest landing zone that could accommodate a medical helicopter, and his injuries meant that any movement could paralyze or kill him. That's when Private Zara Blackthorne, the soldier everyone had written off as too fragile for combat, stepped forward and changed everything anyone thought they knew about what it means to be strong. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand what made that day so extraordinary, you need to know exactly who everyone thought Zara Blackthorne was, and why 8 months of military training had convinced an entire platoon that she was the weakest link in their chain. Private Zara Blackthorne was everything a combat soldier wasn't supposed to be. At 5 feet 2 inches and 115 pounds, she looked like a strong wind could knock her over, let alone enemy fire. Her standard-issue body armor hung loose on her small frame, and her M4 carbine seemed comically oversized in her delicate hands. When she walked, there was an almost graceful quality to her movement that spoke of dance classes or yoga studios, not obstacle courses and combat training. Her face told the same story of someone who didn't belong in a war zone. High cheekbones and fair skin that burned easily under the harsh Kandohar sun, despite constant applications of military-issue sunscreen. Her green eyes had a thoughtful, almost scholarly quality that made her look like she was perpetually analyzing literature rather than scanning for potential threats. Even when she tried to look intimidating during training exercises, there was something inherently gentle about her expression that undermined any attempt at appearing fierce. The other soldiers noticed everything. How she needed help lifting ammunition crates that others handled solo. How she was always the last to finish physical training exercises, often by significant margins. During their weekly 12-mile ruck marches through the mountain terrain, Zara would finish red-faced and exhausted, while soldiers like Corporal Hastings barely seemed winded. Her hands, soft and uncalloused when she'd first arrived, still showed the signs of someone more accustomed to turning pages than field-stripping weapons. "She tries hard, I'll give her that," Private First Class Danny Chun had observed to his bunkmate after watching Zara struggle through yet another combat drill. "But trying hard doesn't stop bullets. When the shooting starts, I want someone next to me who can carry their own weight, not someone I'm going to have to babysit." The nickname Pixie had started as a cruel joke, but had stuck because it captured how everyone saw her: tiny, delicate, almost mythical in how out of place she seemed. During mess hall conversations, soldiers would place bets on how long she'd last before requesting a transfer to a non-combat role. The smart money was always on soon. Even her personal habits reinforced the image of someone who didn't belong. While other soldiers spent their downtime cleaning weapons, playing cards, or working out, Zara could often be found reading books she'd somehow managed to bring with her: thick novels and academic texts that seemed bizarre choices for a forward operating base. She wrote in journals, maintained correspondence with what appeared to be professors from her previous academic life, and spoke with a vocabulary that occasionally made her sound more like a graduate student than a private in the infantry. Her bunk area reflected the same disconnect. While others decorated their spaces with pictures of trucks, weapons, or pin-up girls, Zara's section was organized with an almost academic precision. Her few personal belongings were arranged in a way that suggested someone accustomed to a dorm room rather than military quarters. She had photographs of what appeared to be university friends in graduation gowns, not family members in military uniforms. The physical training scores told the same story of inadequacy. On the Army physical fitness test, Zara consistently scored in the lowest acceptable range. Her 2-mile run times were barely within regulations. Her push-up count was minimal, and her sit-ups were adequate but unimpressive. During combat-specific training like the combat fitness test, she struggled with exercises that required carrying heavy equipment over distance or navigating obstacles while burdened with gear. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had tried to be fair, but even he couldn't ignore the obvious disparities. "Blackthorne's got heart," he'd told Lieutenant Morrison during one of their weekly personnel reviews. "She never complains, never gives up, always volunteers for extra duty. But heart doesn't make up for a 40-pound weight disadvantage when you need someone to haul wounded soldiers to safety or carry extra ammunition during extended firefights." The other squad members had reached their own conclusions through 8 months of shared experiences. During training exercises, Zara was consistently the soldier who needed assistance, who slowed down operations, who required others to compensate for her limitations. When they practiced buddy carries, the fundamental military technique of rescuing wounded comrades, Zara could barely manage to lift soldiers who were significantly smaller than the 200-pound Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. "It's not her fault, Private," Williams had said after a particularly difficult training session where Zara had needed help from 2 other soldiers to complete a simulated casualty evacuation. "She's probably a good person, but this job requires certain physical capabilities, and she just doesn't have them. It's like asking someone who's afraid of heights to be a paratrooper." Her equipment reflected these limitations. Zara carried a lighter load than standard because command had quietly acknowledged that she couldn't handle full combat weight over extended distances. Her pack contained fewer supplies, her ammunition load was reduced, and she'd been assigned support roles that kept her away from the most physically demanding aspects of combat operations. The perception was unanimous. Private Zara Blackthorne was a well-meaning young woman who had somehow found herself in the wrong profession. She was the soldier you hoped would be reassigned before real combat began, not because anyone wished her harm, but because everyone understood that war was unforgiving to those who couldn't meet its physical demands. What none of them knew was that appearances, especially in combat, can be devastatingly deceiving. But if you looked closely, really closely, there were subtle signs that Private Zara Blackthorne wasn't quite what she appeared to be. Moments that didn't fit the narrative of a fragile academic who'd stumbled into military service. Small inconsistencies that most people missed because they were so convinced they already knew who she was. During their first week of mountain warfare training, while other soldiers struggled with the altitude and terrain navigation, Zara had displayed an uncanny ability to read topographical maps. Not just basic map reading, any soldier could do that, but an almost intuitive understanding of how elevation changes would affect movement, where natural cover would be available, and which routes would provide tactical advantages. When Sergeant Rodriguez had asked her to identify potential ambush sites during a terrain analysis exercise, she'd pointed out locations that even experienced mountain fighters might miss. "How'd you know about that ravine position?" Rodriguez had asked, genuinely curious about her unusually sophisticated tactical assessment. Zara had shrugged, seemingly embarrassed by the attention. "Just ... makes sense, I guess. If I wanted to stop someone from moving through here, that's where I'd position myself." The response was modest, almost dismissive, but Rodriguez filed it away as oddly perceptive for someone who supposedly had no military background beyond basic training. Then there were her reactions during combat simulations. While Zara struggled physically with carrying equipment and keeping pace during marches, something changed when live-fire exercises began. Her breathing remained steady under simulated enemy fire. Her hands didn't shake when explosions went off nearby. Most tellingly, while other soldiers showed natural startle responses to unexpected loud noises, flashbang grenades, artillery simulators, aircraft flyovers, Zara barely flinched. Private Chun had noticed it first during a particularly intense training scenario involving simulated IED explosions. "Did you see Blackthorne during that last drill?" he'd mentioned to his squad mate. "Everyone else hit the deck when that simulator went off, but she just ... kept moving. Like she's heard that sound before." "Probably just froze up," his buddy had responded. Some people shut down instead of reacting. Not exactly a good thing in combat. But Chun wasn't convinced it was freezing. Zara's movements during the exercise had been deliberate, controlled. She'd immediately sought cover, but her positioning was tactically sound, not the random panic of someone overwhelmed by chaos, but the calculated response of someone who understood battlefield dynamics. Her shooting scores told a similar story of hidden competence. While Zara's physical fitness scores were barely adequate, her marksmanship was surprisingly consistent. Not exceptional, she wasn't setting any records, but her groupings were tight. Her trigger control was steady, and she seemed to have an intuitive understanding of how environmental factors affected bullet trajectory. During windy conditions that threw off even experienced shooters, Zara made adjustments that suggested a deeper understanding of ballistics than basic training typically provided. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had pulled her aside after one particularly challenging marksmanship exercise. "Blackthorne, you're shooting solid. Better than solid, actually. Where'd you learn to adjust for wind drift like that?" Again that modest shrug. "My dad took me hunting sometimes when I was younger. Guess I picked up a few things." The explanation was plausible, but Rodriguez had grown up hunting too, and weekend trips with Dad didn't usually produce the kind of technical shooting skills Zara displayed. Still, she was so unassuming about it, so genuinely surprised when anyone complimented her abilities, that it was easy to dismiss as natural talent rather than formal training. Perhaps most intriguingly, Zara demonstrated an unusual familiarity with military equipment that went beyond her official training. During weapons maintenance sessions, her hands moved with a confidence that suggested muscle memory rather than recent instruction. She could field strip and reassemble her M4 carbine faster than soldiers who'd been in service longer. When they'd been introduced to the squad automatic weapon, she'd handled it like she'd seen one before, instinctively knowing which components required the most attention during cleaning. "You sure you haven't done this before?" Corporal Hastings had asked, watching her efficiently work through a weapons malfunction drill that typically frustrated new soldiers. "Pretty sure I'd remember if I had," Zara had replied with a smile. That seemed genuine, but somehow didn't quite reach her eyes. There were other small things. Her uniform, while regulation, showed signs of being tailored by someone who understood military standards better than most recruits. Her boots were broken. Imperfectly not new enough to suggest a complete novice, but not worn enough to indicate long service. Her personal hygiene kit contained items that suggested familiarity with field conditions, specific brands of foot powder preferred by experienced soldiers, a particular type of lip balm known for extreme weather protection, toiletries chosen for durability rather than comfort. During medical training exercises, Zara displayed knowledge that went beyond the basic first aid all soldiers received. When they'd practiced treating simulated gunshot wounds, her pressure point techniques were precise, her understanding of trauma priorities was sophisticated, and she seemed to anticipate complications that other soldiers missed. The medic instructor had complimented her performance, noting that she had good instincts for emergency medicine. "Ever think about becoming a combat medic?" the instructor had asked. "You've got the temperament for it, and your technical skills are already above average." Zara had declined politely, claiming she was content with her current role, but the instructor had noticed how confidently she'd handled simulated medical emergencies that typically made soldiers queasy. Most curious of all were her sleeping patterns. While other soldiers struggled with the adjustment to military schedules and the stress of potential combat deployment, Zara seemed almost immediately comfortable with irregular sleep, sudden wake-ups, and the constant low-level alertness required in a forward operating base. She never appeared startled by middle-of-the-night alerts or emergency drills. Her transition from sleep to full combat readiness was remarkably smooth for someone supposedly new to military life. "She adapts fast," Private Williams had observed. After watching Zara smoothly handle her third consecutive night of interrupted sleep due to security alerts. "Most people take weeks to get used to never really sleeping soundly. She was doing it from day one." But perhaps the most telling sign was something that happened during their advanced combat training in urban warfare scenarios. The exercise involved clearing buildings in a mock village, with instructors playing the role of civilians and enemy combatants. It was designed to test soldiers' ability to make split-second decisions about threats while protecting non-combatants. Zara's performance during this exercise was flawless. Not just competent flawless. Her movement through buildings showed an understanding of urban combat principles that typically required extensive specialized training. She seemed to instinctively know which corners presented the greatest threat, how to use doorways for maximum tactical advantage, and when to engage targets versus when to seek better positioning. Most impressively, during one scenario involving a simulated hostage situation, Zara had identified a solution that even the instructors hadn't fully anticipated. Her tactical assessment was sophisticated enough that the exercise was paused while senior staff discussed her proposed approach. "Where did that come from?" Rodriguez had asked her afterward, genuinely puzzled by the advanced tactical thinking she'd displayed. "I don't know," Zara had answered, and for the first time, she'd seemed as surprised by her own performance as everyone else was. It just felt like the right thing to do. These moments of unexpected competence were scattered across 8 months of otherwise consistent mediocrity. Individually, each incident could be explained away as natural talent, lucky guesses, or simple coincidence. But taken together, they painted a picture of someone whose official capabilities didn't match their actual abilities. The problem was that these glimpses of hidden skill were overshadowed by Zara's obvious physical limitations and consistent struggles with basic military tasks. It was easier to focus on what she couldn't do: carry heavy loads, keep pace on long marches, meet superior physical fitness standards, than to question what her occasional flashes of expertise might mean. No. One suspected that Private Zara Blackthorne might be hiding something significant about her background. No one imagined that her modest explanations for her unusual skills might be carefully crafted deflections rather than honest confusion about her own abilities. And absolutely no one anticipated that when real combat finally came to Forward Operating Base Thunderclap, those scattered hints of hidden competence would explode into a demonstration of capabilities that would force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the soldier they'd nicknamed Pixie. The truth about Private Zara Blackthorne was buried in classified files that would never see the light of day, hidden behind security clearances and government redactions that made her current military service record look like an elaborate cover story. Because 3 years before she'd enlisted as a seemingly fragile infantry soldier, Captain Zara Blackthorne had been one of the most lethal special operations officers in the entire United States military. She'd graduated summa cum laude from the United States Military Academy at West Point with a double major in international relations and Arabic studies. Her academic performance had been exemplary, but what set her apart was her selection for the Army's most secretive advanced training programs while still a cadet. By age 20, she'd completed Ranger School, airborne training, and had been hand-picked for the Special Operations Forces community, achievements that typically took career soldiers years to accomplish. After commissioning as a second lieutenant, Zara had been fast-tracked into the 75th Ranger Regiment, where her small stature became an unexpected tactical advantage. In special operations, being underestimated was often more valuable than being physically imposing. Her size allowed her to move through spaces that larger soldiers couldn't access. Her academic intelligence translated perfectly to complex mission planning, and her language skills made her invaluable for operations requiring cultural sensitivity and local interaction. Within 2 years, she'd been promoted to first lieutenant and selected for cross-training with Delta Force units, where she'd specialized in high-value target capture and urban warfare operations. Her official military occupational specialty was listed as intelligence officer, but her actual duties involved leading teams into hostile territory to capture or eliminate enemy commanders, conducting reconnaissance missions deep behind enemy lines, and training indigenous forces in unconventional warfare tactics. Captain Zara Blackthorne had been deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and classified locations across 3 continents. She'd led missions that resulted in the capture of high-value terrorist targets, had coordinated airstrikes that disrupted major enemy operations, and had personally been responsible for intelligence gathering that prevented multiple planned attacks on civilian targets. Her service record included 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and commendations that were classified at levels requiring congressional oversight to declassify. She'd mastered skills that regular infantry soldiers never learned: advanced mountaineering, techniques for high-altitude operations, urban warfare tactics designed for fighting in dense civilian populations, psychological operations principles for managing local informants, and counterintelligence methods for operating in areas where enemy infiltration was constant. Her weapons training went far beyond standard military firearms to include specialized equipment used only by elite units, suppressed sniper systems, explosive ordnance disposal, and close-quarters combat techniques designed for killing silently and efficiently, most relevantly for what would happen at Forward Operating Base Thunderclap. Captain Blackthorne had been an expert in personnel recovery operations, the specialized military discipline of extracting wounded or captured soldiers from hostile territory. She'd completed advanced training in battlefield medicine, had led multiple successful rescue missions under fire, and had personally carried wounded soldiers through terrain that would challenge Olympic athletes. Her physical training regimen had been designed specifically for these scenarios, building functional strength that prioritized endurance and load-bearing capacity over raw muscle mass. Her psychological profile had identified her as someone uniquely suited for high-stress operations. Military psychologists noted her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, her talent for making split-second tactical decisions, and her natural leadership capabilities that emerged most clearly during crisis situations. She'd been the soldier that other elite soldiers looked to when missions went sideways, and improvisation became the difference between success and catastrophic failure. But Captain Zara Blackthorne's military career had ended abruptly during a classified operation in eastern Afghanistan. Her team had been conducting a high-priority target capture mission when intelligence failures resulted in an ambush that killed 3 of her soldiers and wounded 2 others. The investigation found no fault with her tactical decisions. The mission had been compromised by intelligence leaks that were beyond her control, but Zara couldn't forgive herself for leading her people into a trap. The psychological evaluation following the incident noted signs of what military psychologists called command trauma, a condition affecting leaders who blame themselves for casualties that occur under their command, regardless of whether those casualties were preventable. Zara had begun questioning every decision she made, second-guessing tactical judgments that had previously been instinctive, and experiencing what her therapist described as catastrophic responsibility syndrome, the belief that her leadership decisions carried life or death consequences for everyone around her. Rather than accept a medical discharge or pursue treatment that might have restored her confidence, Captain Blackthorne had made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She'd requested release from special operations, resignation of her commission, and immediate re-enlistment as a regular infantry private. Her stated reason was a desire to serve without the burden of command responsibility, but her real motivation was more complex. She wanted to find a way to continue serving while escaping the crushing weight of being responsible for other soldiers' lives. The military had tried to dissuade her. Officers with her qualifications and experience were rare and valuable. Her commanding officers had offered alternative assignments, different career paths, extended leave time, anything that would keep her skills and experience in service at an appropriate level. But Zara had been adamant. She wanted to serve as a regular soldier, to follow orders rather than give them, to contribute without carrying the responsibility that had destroyed her confidence. To make this transition possible, her service record had been carefully sanitized. Her special operations experience was classified beyond the clearance level of anyone she'd be serving with. Her previous rank and achievements were buried in files that required special authorization to access. Officially, Private Zara Blackthorne was exactly what her current personnel file indicated: a college graduate who'd enlisted after civilian university, completed basic training, and been assigned to regular infantry duty. The physical training standards that made her appear weak were calibrated for soldiers who'd never received the specialized conditioning that special operations required. The tactical knowledge she occasionally displayed was explained away as natural talent rather than the result of thousands of hours of advanced military education. Her comfort with combat situations reflected training that was far more sophisticated than anything regular infantry soldiers received. For 8 months, the deception had been perfect. Zara had successfully convinced everyone around her that she was exactly what she appeared to be: a small, academically minded young woman who was struggling to adapt to military life. She'd found the peace she'd been seeking, serving without the crushing responsibility of command, contributing without carrying the weight of leadership decisions that could result in casualties. She'd been content to let everyone think she was weak, fragile, unsuited for combat. It was easier than explaining why a decorated special operations officer was voluntarily serving as a private in regular infantry. It was simpler than revealing that her apparent limitations were self-imposed, that her struggles with standard military tasks were the result of deliberately hiding capabilities that far exceeded anything her current unit required. Private Zara Blackthorne had found a way to serve without the psychological burden that had ended her career as Captain Blackthorne. She'd been happy to be underestimated, relieved to be considered the weak link, grateful for the anonymity that let her contribute without carrying the responsibility for other soldiers' lives. But when Staff Sergeant Rodriguez lay bleeding in that mountain ravine, with insurgent fire keeping medical evacuation impossible and 2 miles of hostile terrain between him and safety, All of Zara's carefully constructed limitations were about to be exposed as the fiction they'd always been, the incident that had destroyed Captain Zara Blackthorne's confidence and driven her to abandon everything she'd worked for had happened on a moonless night in the Koringal Valley, during what should have been a routine high-value target capture mission. Operation Silent Thunder was supposed to be the kind of surgical strike that special operations units executed flawlessly dozens of times each year. Infiltrate, capture, extract with minimal casualties and maximum intelligence value. Zara had been leading a 6-person team tasked with capturing Malik al-Rashid, a mid-level Taliban commander who intelligence indicated was planning attacks on civilian targets in Kabul. The mission parameters were clear: non-lethal capture preferred, elimination authorized if capture proved impossible, civilian casualties absolutely prohibited. It was the type of assignment that Captain Blackthorne had completed successfully 17 times during her previous deployments. The intelligence briefing had been thorough. Al-Rashid was staying in a compound approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest coalition forces, in territory that was contested, but not actively hostile. Local informants had provided detailed layouts of the building, confirmed the target's presence, and indicated minimal security presence. Satellite reconnaissance had confirmed the intelligence assessments. Every piece of information suggested a straightforward operation with low risk of complications. Zara's team had consisted of soldiers she'd worked with for over a year. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, her second-in-command and closest friend in the unit. Sergeant First Class David Kim, a communications specialist who'd saved their lives during 3 previous missions. Corporal Amanda Foster, a medic whose battlefield medicine skills were legendary throughout the special operations community. Private First Class James Murphy, a demolitions expert who could disable security systems without triggering alarms. And Specialist Sarah Chun, a sniper whose precision shooting had earned her recognition throughout the Special Forces community. They'd infiltrated the target area without incident, moving through terrain that Zara knew intimately from previous operations. Her team moved with the silent efficiency that came from months of working together, anticipating each other's movements, communicating through hand signals, and practiced coordination that required no verbal instruction. Everything proceeded exactly according to plan until they reached the compound perimeter. The first indication that something was wrong came from Chun, who was providing overwatch from a position 400 meters from the target building. "Multiple heat signatures inside," she'd whispered through the radio. "Count is higher than intelligence indicated. I'm seeing at least 12 individuals, possibly more." Zara had paused the operation to reassess. 12 people in a building that was supposed to contain 4 or 5 suggested either a significant intelligence failure or a change in circumstances that hadn't been anticipated. But the mission parameters were clear. Al-Rashid represented an imminent threat to civilian lives, and delaying the operation could result in attacks that would kill innocent people. "How's our target identification?" Zara had asked Chun, who had thermal imaging equipment that could distinguish between individuals based on size and movement patterns. "Positive identification on Al-Rashid in the northeastern room, 2nd floor. He appears to be meeting with unknown individuals. No visual confirmation on weapons, but movement patterns suggest heightened security awareness." The decision Zara made next would haunt her for the rest of her life. Standard operating procedure suggested calling for additional support or aborting the mission when target parameters changed significantly. But additional support would take hours to arrange, and Al-Rashid's intelligence value was time-sensitive. The attacks he was planning were scheduled to occur within days, possibly hours. "We proceed with modified approach," Zara had decided. "Torres and Kim will create a distraction on the ground floor while Foster and I extract the target from the 2nd floor. Murphy maintains perimeter security. Chun provides overwatch and early warning. It was a tactical decision that made sense. Based on the information available, Zara's team had successfully adapted to changing circumstances during previous missions, and their training emphasized flexibility and initiative when rigid adherence to original plans became counterproductive. Every member of her team was capable of handling roles beyond their primary specialization, and the modified approach utilized their combined expertise effectively. The infiltration proceeded flawlessly. Murphy disabled the compound security systems without triggering alarms. Torres and Kim positioned themselves to create a controlled distraction that would draw attention away from the target's location. Foster prepared medical supplies in case the capture resulted in injuries requiring immediate treatment. Shun maintained overwatch that would provide early warning if additional enemy forces approached the compound. Zara and Foster had reached the second floor and were approaching Al-Rashid's location when Shun's voice crackled through their headsets with words that would replay in Zara's nightmares for years afterward. Multiple vehicles approaching from the east. Large force, heavily armed. This is a setup. The realization hit Zara like a physical blow. The intelligence hadn't been wrong about the number of people in the compound. It had been deliberately falsified. Al-Rashid wasn't conducting a routine meeting. He was hosting a gathering specifically designed to draw coalition forces into an ambush. The additional people in the building weren't random visitors. They were armed fighters waiting for exactly the kind of special operations team that Zara was leading. All units, immediate extract, Zara had ordered, but it was already too late. The compound erupted in gunfire as hidden fighters revealed their positions. Torres and Kim, caught in the ground floor distraction that was supposed to provide cover, found themselves in a kill zone designed specifically to trap soldiers attempting exactly the maneuver they were executing. The firefight that followed lasted 17 minutes and forever changed how Zara understood the weight of command decisions. Torres, her closest friend and most trusted subordinate, died attempting to provide covering fire for Kim's evacuation. Kim himself was severely wounded, but survived long enough for Foster to attempt medical treatment before succumbing to injuries that no battlefield medicine could address. Murphy was killed by a sniper while attempting to maintain perimeter security. Against odds that were impossible to overcome, Foster and Chun survived, but both carried wounds that would end their military careers. The mission that was supposed to capture one terrorist had resulted in 3 deaths and 2 permanent disabilities among soldiers whose lives Zara was responsible for protecting. Al-Rashid escaped during the chaos, later surfacing in intelligence reports as having successfully conducted the civilian attacks that the mission was supposed to prevent. The official investigation concluded that Operation Silent Thunder had failed due to intelligence compromise rather than tactical errors. Zara's decisions were deemed appropriate based on the information available to her, and the mission failure was attributed to systematic intelligence failures rather than command incompetence. She was cleared of any wrongdoing and recommended for commendation for her leadership during the extraction of surviving team members under heavy enemy fire. But official vindication couldn't erase the crushing weight of knowing that her tactical decisions that made sense at the time, decisions that followed her training and experience, decisions that any competent officer would have made, had directly resulted in the deaths of soldiers who trusted her with their lives. The fact that she'd followed protocol correctly somehow made it worse. If she'd made obvious mistakes, she could have learned from them and improved. Instead, she'd done everything right and still gotten her people killed. The psychological evaluation following the incident identified classic symptoms of command trauma, but Zara's response went beyond typical cases. She didn't just doubt her tactical judgment. She'd become convinced that her very presence in leadership positions was a threat to the soldiers under her command. The weight of responsibility that had once felt natural and appropriate now seemed like an unbearable burden that she was fundamentally unfit to carry. Captain Zara Blackthorne had entered Operation Silent Thunder as a confident, accomplished Special Operations Officer. She'd emerged as someone who could no longer trust herself with other soldiers' lives, someone who believed that her command decisions would inevitably result in casualties, that better leaders might prevent that transformation. Explained why she'd voluntarily abandoned everything she'd worked for. Why she'd chosen to serve as a private rather than accept treatment that might restore her confidence. Why she'd been content to let everyone think she was weak and unsuited for responsibility. Private Zara Blackthorne wasn't hiding her capabilities out of modesty or deception. She was protecting other soldiers from a leader she believed was fundamentally dangerous to their survival. But psychological wounds, like physical ones, don't always heal in the ways that seem logical or permanent. And sometimes the very situations that create trauma also provide the circumstances necessary for overcoming it. For 8 months, Private Zara Blackthorne had successfully lived the lie she'd constructed for herself. She'd found a strange kind of peace in being exactly what everyone expected her to be. The weakest soldier in Delta Company's 3rd Platoon, the one who struggled with basic tasks, the fragile academic who'd somehow ended up in a combat zone. It was a carefully maintained performance that protected her from the crushing weight of responsibility that had destroyed her previous life. Her daily routine at Forward Operating Base Thunderclap had become a comforting ritual of deliberate mediocrity. Each morning, she'd wake up knowing exactly what was expected of her, struggle through physical training, perform adequately, but unremarkably during weapons maintenance, lag behind during patrol preparations, and generally fulfill everyone's expectations of incompetence. There was a perverse comfort in being underestimated, in knowing that no one would ever look to her for critical decisions or life or death leadership. The other soldiers had stopped trying to include her in their informal leadership discussions months ago. When they planned weekend training exercises or discussed tactical improvements, they'd naturally gravitate toward soldiers like Corporal Hastings or Private Chun soldiers who showed promise for future advancement. Zara had carefully ensured that she was never part of those conversations, never positioned as someone whose opinions might influence important decisions. She developed subtle techniques for maintaining her facade of weakness. During combat drills, she'd deliberately slow her movements just enough to appear clumsy without being obviously incompetent. When cleaning weapons, she'd occasionally ask questions about procedures she could perform flawlessly, creating the impression that her competence was limited to basic tasks. Her shooting scores were managed carefully good enough to avoid remedial training, but never so impressive that anyone would consider her for specialized roles. The psychological benefits of this deception had been immediate and profound. For the first time since Operation Silent Thunder, Zara slept through the night without nightmares about Torres dying while following her orders. She could clean her weapon without thinking about Kim's wounds, could participate in training exercises without calculating how her tactical decisions might. The firefight that followed lasted 17 minutes and forever changed how Zara understood the weight of command decisions. Torres, her closest friend and most trusted subordinate, died attempting to provide covering fire for Kim's evacuation. Kim himself was severely wounded, but survived long enough for Foster to attempt medical treatment before succumbing to injuries that no battlefield medicine could address. Murphy was killed by a sniper while attempting to maintain perimeter security. Against odds that were impossible to overcome, Foster and Chun survived, but both carried wounds that would end their military careers. The mission that was supposed to capture one terrorist had resulted in 3 deaths and 2 permanent disabilities among soldiers whose lives Zara was responsible for protecting. Al-Rashid escaped during the chaos, later surfacing in intelligence reports as having successfully conducted the civilian attacks that the mission was supposed to prevent. The official investigation concluded that Operation Silent Thunder had failed due to intelligence compromise rather than tactical errors. Zara's decisions were deemed appropriate based on the information available to her. and the mission failure was attributed to systematic intelligence failures rather than command incompetence. She was cleared of any wrongdoing and recommended for commendation for her leadership during the extraction of surviving team members under heavy enemy fire. But official vindication couldn't erase the crushing weight of knowing that her tactical decisions that made sense at the time, decisions that followed her training and experience, decisions that any competent officer would have made, had directly resulted in the deaths of soldiers who trusted her with their lives. The fact that she'd followed protocol correctly somehow made it worse. If she'd made obvious mistakes, she could have learned from them and improved. Instead, she'd done everything right and still gotten her people killed. The psychological evaluation following the incident identified classic symptoms of command trauma, but Zara's response went beyond typical cases. She didn't just doubt her tactical judgment. She'd become convinced that her very presence in leadership positions was a threat to the soldiers under her command. The weight of responsibility that had once felt natural and appropriate now seemed like an unbearable burden that she was fundamentally unfit to carry. Captain Zara Blackthorne had entered Operation Silent Thunder as a confident, accomplished Special Operations Officer. She'd emerged as someone who could no longer trust herself with other soldiers' lives, someone who believed that her command decisions would inevitably result in casualties, that better leaders might prevent. That transformation explained why she'd voluntarily abandoned everything she'd worked for, why she'd chosen to serve as a private rather than accept treatment that might restore her confidence, why she'd been content to let everyone think she was weak and unsuited for responsibility. Private Zara Blackthorne wasn't hiding her capabilities out of modesty or deception. She was protecting other soldiers from a leader she believed was fundamentally dangerous to their survival. But psychological wounds, like physical ones, don't always heal in the ways that seem logical or permanent. And sometimes the very situations that create trauma also provide the circumstances necessary for overcoming it. For 8 months, Private Zara Blackthorne had successfully lived the lie she'd constructed for herself. The physical aspects of her deception had required careful calibration. Her special operations conditioning had included training specifically designed for carrying wounded soldiers across difficult terrain, exactly the kind of functional strength that wouldn't show up in standard physical fitness tests. She was actually capable of carrying loads that would surprise soldiers twice her size, but maintaining that capability while appearing to struggle with basic military tasks required constantly walking a fine line between obvious incompetence and suspicious competence. Her personal relationships reflected this careful balance. She developed genuine friendships with several soldiers in her unit, but always within the context of being the weakest member of the group. They liked her because she was humble, hardworking, and never complained about her limitations. She'd become the unit's unofficial mascot, someone they felt protective toward rather than someone they relied upon for protection. The approaching patrol that would change everything had seemed like just another routine mission. Intelligence reports suggested minimal enemy activity in their assigned sector, and Zara's role was typically simple: stay with the main group, follow orders, avoid creating complications for more experienced soldiers. She'd packed her equipment the night before, carefully ensuring that her load appeared appropriately challenging for someone of her supposed capabilities while actually representing a fraction of what she could comfortably carry. She'd reviewed the patrol route and mentally noted several tactical concerns: potential ambush sites, escape routes, communication dead zones, but planned to keep those observations to herself unless directly asked. Her role was to be a follower, not a tactical analyst, and maintaining that distinction was crucial to preserving the psychological protection that her false identity provided. The morning of September 15th had begun like dozens of similar mornings. Over the previous 8 months, Zara had struggled through physical training with her usual apparent difficulty, eaten breakfast while listening to other soldiers discuss patrol preparations, and methodically prepared her equipment with the careful competence that everyone expected from her. She'd felt the familiar comfort of knowing exactly what was expected of her: be present, follow orders, and avoid drawing attention to capabilities that might lead to responsibilities she was no longer able to handle. As third platoon formed up for the patrol that would take them into the Kandohar Mountains, Zara had taken her customary position near the rear of the formation. It was where weak soldiers belonged, where she could contribute without being relied upon for critical decisions, where she could serve her country without carrying the crushing weight of command responsibility that had destroyed her previous life. She had no way of knowing that within hours, the comfortable fiction she'd constructed would be shattered by circumstances that would make hiding her true capabilities not just impossible, but morally unconscionable. The peaceful deception that had protected her psychological wounds was about to collide with a crisis that would force her to choose between maintaining her carefully constructed weakness and saving the life of a soldier who'd become more than just her squad leader. He'd become proof that she could serve alongside good soldiers without getting them killed. The morning air in the Kandohar Mountains carried the crisp bite of autumn, with visibility extending for miles across the rugged terrain that third platoon would be traversing. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had briefed the 8-person patrol on their mission parameters during the pre-dawn preparation, a routine reconnaissance sweep along suspected insurgent supply routes, with intelligence suggesting minimal enemy presence and low probability of contact. It was exactly the kind of mission that had become standard for Delta Company, important enough to require attention, but routine enough that even their weakest soldiers could participate without creating unacceptable risk. Zara had listened to the briefing while methodically checking equipment that she could have prepared in her sleep. Her M4 carbine was clean and properly zeroed. Her ammunition was distributed according to standard load plans, and her radio equipment was functioning within normal parameters. To anyone observing, she appeared to be a conscientious soldier performing routine preparations with appropriate attention to detail. What they couldn't see was how her special operations training had already identified 17 potential tactical concerns, with their planned route concerns that she kept carefully to herself. The patrol formation reflected standard infantry doctrine for movement through potentially hostile terrain. Corporal Hastings served as point man, using his experience and alertness to identify threats before the main body encountered them. Private Chun and Private Williams moved as the primary body, maintaining visual contact with both the point man and the rear security. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez positioned himself in the center of the formation where he could maintain command and control while monitoring the overall tactical situation. Zara's position at the rear of the formation was tactically sound for a soldier with her apparent limitations. Rear security was important but less demanding than point or flank positions, and her placement there ensured that more experienced soldiers could compensate if she struggled to maintain pace or situational awareness. It was a role that matched everyone's expectations of her capabilities while keeping her close enough to the main body that she couldn't become separated or lost. The first 3 hours of movement proceeded exactly according to plan. The terrain was challenging but manageable, with rocky paths that wound through narrow valleys and across ridgelines that provided excellent observation of the surrounding area. Rodriguez maintained regular radio contact with their forward operating base, reporting their progress and confirming that they'd encountered no signs of enemy activity. Zara found herself falling into the familiar rhythm of patrol movement, the steady pace that conserved energy over long distances, the constant visual scanning that identified potential threats or points of interest, the automatic adjustment of equipment that prevented noise or discomfort during extended movement. Her body performed these tasks with muscle memory that dated back to her special operations training, but she was careful to appear appropriately challenged by the physical demands of carrying her equipment across difficult terrain. The other Soldiers seemed relaxed and confident, chatting quietly during rest breaks and maintaining the easy camaraderie that developed among troops who'd worked together for months without encountering serious threats. Their conversation focused on typical soldier concerns, upcoming leave schedules, packages from home, speculation about their next assignment rotation. It was the kind of normal military life that Zara had learned to appreciate, predictable, safe and free from the life or death decisions that had characterized her previous service. Rodriguez had chosen their patrol route to maximize intelligence gathering while minimizing risk to his soldiers. They were following known paths that provided good observation of potential enemy supply routes while staying close enough to establish coalition positions that they could call for support if circumstances changed. The route would take them through terrain that was familiar from previous patrols, with identified rally points and extraction sites that could be used if emergency evacuation became necessary. Dotted approximately 1,030 hours. They'd reached what Rodriguez designated as Checkpoint Alpha, a rocky outcropping that provided excellent observation of a valley where intelligence suggested enemy forces might be moving supplies. The position offered good cover and multiple escape routes, making it an ideal location for the kind of surveillance mission they'd been assigned. Rodriguez had planned to spend 2 hours at this position, observing and documenting any activity that might indicate enemy presence. The insurgents had been watching them for the previous hour. What 3rd Platoon didn't know was that their patrol route had been compromised by intelligence leaks that had allowed enemy forces to predict their movement with deadly accuracy. The routine reconnaissance mission had become an elaborate trap, with insurgent fighters positioned at carefully chosen locations that would allow them to inflict maximum casualties while preventing effective response or evacuation. The enemy had learned from previous encounters with coalition forces. Rather than attempting to engage superior firepower directly, they developed tactics that exploited the weaknesses inherent in small patrol operations: limited ammunition, restricted communication with supporting units, and vulnerability to coordinated attacks that could overwhelm their defensive capabilities before reinforcements could arrive. At 10:47 hours, while Private Chen was conducting routine observation of the valley below their position, the world exploded into chaos with devastating suddenness. The first explosion came from a remotely detonated improvised explosive device that had been positioned specifically to target the rocky outcropping where Rodriguez had positioned his patrol. The blast was followed immediately by coordinated small arms fire from multiple directions, creating a deadly crossfire that turned their observation position into a killing zone. Rodriguez was caught in the primary blast radius, with shrapnel tearing through his lower back and legs while the concussion threw him against rocks that shattered vertebrae and caused internal injuries that would have killed most soldiers within minutes. Chun and Williams found themselves pinned down by automatic weapons fire that made movement impossible, while Hastings was separated from the main group by enemy fire that prevented him from providing mutual support. The tactical situation was catastrophic. 3rd Platoon was outnumbered by at least 3 to 1, caught in prepared positions that the enemy had chosen specifically to prevent escape or effective defense. Their radio equipment had been damaged in the initial blast, limiting their ability to call for support, and the terrain that had seemed advantageous for observation now trapped them in positions where the enemy held every tactical advantage. Rodriguez lay bleeding in the center of the kill zone, his injury severe enough that any movement might cause additional spinal damage or internal bleeding that would kill him within minutes. The enemy fire was accurate and sustained, suggesting that they were facing experienced fighters who understood how to maintain pressure on trapped coalition forces. Ammunition would become a critical concern within 30 minutes, and medical evacuation was impossible as long as the enemy maintained their positions. For the soldiers of 3rd Platoon, this was the kind of nightmare scenario that training prepared them for, but that no amount of preparation could make survivable through conventional tactics. They needed capabilities that exceeded their official training, leadership that could adapt to impossible circumstances, and most critically, they needed someone who could make the kind of tactical decisions that might save lives even when all standard options had been eliminated. What they had was 7 soldiers with standard infantry training, limited ammunition, compromised communications, and a squad leader who was bleeding to death in terrain that made conventional evacuation impossible. What they needed was someone with special operations experience, advanced tactical training, and the kind of specialized skills that regular infantry soldiers never received. What they didn't know was that Private Zara Blackthorne, the weakest member of their patrol, possessed exactly the capabilities they needed to survive. But accessing those capabilities would require her to abandon the carefully constructed limitations that had protected her psychological wounds for 8 months, and to accept the kind of responsibility that had destroyed her previous military career. The moment of decision was approaching with the inevitability of incoming artillery. And for the first time since Operation Silent Thunder, Zara would be forced to choose between protecting herself and protecting the soldiers, whose lives depended on capabilities she'd sworn never to use again. The impossible mathematics of survival became brutally clear within the first 90 seconds of the ambush. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was bleeding out in the open, his injuries severe enough that moving him incorrectly would cause immediate death, but leaving him where he lay would result in the same outcome within 10 minutes. The enemy had positioned themselves to make conventional rescue impossible. Any soldier who attempted to reach Rodriguez would be exposed to crossfire from at least 3 different positions, turning a rescue attempt into a suicide mission. Corporal Hastings, pinned behind inadequate cover 50 meters from the main group, was attempting to coordinate their response through hand signals, since their primary radio had been destroyed in the initial blast. His assessment was grimly realistic. They had perhaps 20 minutes of ammunition at their current rate of fire, no way to call for reinforcement, and enemy forces that seemed content to maintain their positions and wait for the Americans to exhaust their resources. Private Chun had taken shrapnel in his left shoulder and was struggling to maintain effective suppressing fire with his squad automatic weapon. Blood was soaking through his uniform at an alarming rate, indicating that his wound was more serious than he was letting on. But acknowledging the severity of his injury would further complicate an already impossible tactical situation. Williams was uninjured, but visibly shaken by the intensity of enemy fire, his movements becoming increasingly erratic as the stress of sustained combat began affecting his decision-making. For Zara, crouched behind a boulder that provided minimal protection from the cross-cutting enemy fire, the tactical assessment was overwhelmingly clear. She could see things that the other soldiers couldn't. The precise positioning of enemy fighters based on muzzle flash patterns, the coordination of their fire that indicated professional military training rather than amateur insurgent tactics, the careful way they were conserving ammunition to maintain pressure without exhausting their supplies. More critically, she could see the solution that conventional infantry tactics couldn't provide. The enemy positions were strong but not impregnable. Their coordination was effective, but created predictable patterns that could be exploited by someone with advanced tactical training. Most importantly, Rodriguez could be saved, but only through techniques that regular infantry soldiers weren't trained to perform. The psychological weight of recognition was crushing. Everything about this situation demanded exactly the kind of special operations capabilities that she'd spent 8 months successfully hiding. Saving Rodriguez would require advanced battlefield medicine, tactical movement under fire, and load-bearing techniques that were beyond the physical capabilities that she'd been pretending to possess. Most devastatingly, it would require her to make command decisions, to take responsibility for tactical choices that could get soldiers killed if she guessed wrong about enemy capabilities or timing. But the alternative was watching a good soldier die because she was too psychologically damaged to use skills that could save his life. Zara closed her eyes for 3 seconds, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling around her shoulders like a physical burden. When she opened them, her perspective had shifted in ways that the other soldiers couldn't have anticipated. The terrain that had seemed impossibly dangerous now revealed tactical opportunities. The enemy fire patterns that had appeared random now showed exploitable rhythms. Most importantly, the wounded squad leader who had seemed beyond rescue now represented a problem that had specific, achievable solutions. "Chun," she called out, her voice carrying a note of authority that none of them had heard from her before. "What's your ammunition status?" Chun looked confused by the question coming from the soldier they'd all written off as incompetent. "Maybe 200 rounds left," he replied, wincing as movement aggravated his shoulder wound. "Williams, can you maintain suppressing fire on the ridgeline position for 30 seconds without stopping?" Williams nodded, though his expression suggested he was uncertain why their weakest soldier was suddenly coordinating tactical responses. Zara turned toward Hastings, who was still pinned behind cover but within shouting distance. "Hastings, on my signal, I need you to lay down covering fire on the northwestern position. Maximum rate. Don't worry about accuracy, just keep their heads down." "Blackthorne, what the hell are you doing?" Hastings called back, his voice carrying the strain of a soldier who was struggling to understand how their tactical situation had suddenly shifted from hopeless to potentially manageable. "I'm going to get Rodriguez," Zara replied, and something in her tone made it clear that this wasn't a suggestion or a desperate gamble. It was a statement of tactical intent from someone who had suddenly revealed capabilities that exceeded anything they'd expected from her. The transition was jarring for the other soldiers. 30 seconds earlier, Private Zara Blackthorne had been their weakest team member, someone they were protecting rather than relying upon. Now she was giving tactical orders with the confidence of someone who understood battlefield dynamics at a level that seemed impossible for a soldier with her official training and experience. "How are you planning to reach him?" Chun asked, his question carrying both skepticism and desperate hope. "That's 50 meters of open ground under direct fire from multiple positions." Zara's response revealed knowledge that she shouldn't have possessed. The enemy positions are coordinating their fire in 30-second intervals to conserve ammunition. Their observation of Rodriguez's position is limited by the angle of the rocks where he's lying. If I time the movement correctly and use the dead space created by the terrain elevation, I can reach him during their coordination gap. The tactical analysis was sophisticated enough that even Hastings, with his years of infantry experience, recognized its accuracy. More troubling, it demonstrated a level of battlefield awareness that regular soldiers didn't typically develop, especially soldiers who'd struggled with basic combat training for 8 months. "Even if you reach him," Williams pointed out, "Rodriguez has got to weigh 200 pounds. How are you planning to carry him back under fire?" For a moment, Zara hesitated. Answering that question honestly would require acknowledging capabilities that she'd spent 8 months successfully concealing. But Rodriguez was losing blood at a rate that would kill him within minutes, and conventional solutions were inadequate for the tactical realities they faced. "I can carry him," she said simply, and something in her voice suggested that this wasn't bravado or desperation, but a statement based on knowledge and experience that the others couldn't understand. The moment had arrived when Zara would be forced to choose between maintaining the psychological protection that had allowed her to serve without responsibility and accepting the kind of leadership role that had destroyed her confidence during Operation Silent Thunder. Rodriguez was dying, her fellow soldiers were trapped in an impossible tactical situation, and the only solutions required her to abandon the carefully constructed limitations that had protected her from exactly this kind of life or death decision-making. "What do you need from us?" Hastings asked, and his question represented a fundamental shift in how 3rd Platoon understood the capabilities of their supposedly weakest member. Zara looked at Rodriguez, bleeding in the center of the kill zone, then at the soldiers who were suddenly looking to her for leadership that she'd sworn never to provide again. The weight of command responsibility was settling around her shoulders with familiar, crushing intensity. But for the first time since Operation Silent Thunder, other considerations were more important than protecting herself from psychological trauma. "Give me covering fire on my count," she said, already mentally calculating movement routes and timing that would allow her to reach Rodriguez before enemy fire could adjust to her position, and be ready to provide suppressing fire for our withdrawal. This is going to require precise timing and maximum aggression. The transformation was complete. Private Zara Blackthorne, the fragile soldier who'd struggled with basic military tasks, had been replaced by someone whose tactical competence exceeded anything that regular infantry training could provide. What her fellow soldiers didn't yet understand was that they were about to witness capabilities that would force them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about leadership, physical strength, and what it meant to be ready for combat. The impossible choice had been made, and its consequences would define not just whether Rodriguez survived, but whether Zara could find a way to use her devastating capabilities without destroying herself in the process. Execute covering fire in 3.2.1. Mark, Zara's voice carried across the battlefield with a command authority that transformed the tactical situation instantaneously. What followed was the most shocking display of combat capability that any member of 3rd Platoon had ever witnessed from someone they'd considered their weakest soldier. Zara moved across the kill zone with a fluidity that defied everything the other soldiers thought they knew about her physical limitations. Instead of the awkward, struggling movements they'd observed during 8 months of training exercises, she flowed through the terrain with the precision of someone who understood exactly how to use every rock, depression, and elevation change to minimize exposure to enemy fire. Her route wasn't the direct path that untrained soldiers might have chosen, but a carefully calculated approach that exploited dead spaces in the enemy's overlapping fields of fire. Her speed was equally stunning. The soldier who'd consistently finished last during conditioning runs was covering 50 meters of hostile terrain faster than soldiers twice her size typically managed on flat ground. But more than speed, her movement demonstrated a tactical sophistication that suggested training far beyond anything regular infantry received. She wasn't just running toward Rodriguez. She was executing a combat approach that minimized exposure time while maximizing the effectiveness of her squad's covering fire. Corporal Hastings, providing suppressive fire as ordered, found himself staring in disbelief at Zara's tactical movement. "What the hell?" he muttered, continuing to engage enemy positions while trying to process what he was witnessing. The soldier he'd been protecting for months was demonstrating combat skills that exceeded his own capabilities by a significant margin. When Zara reached Rodriguez's position, her transformation became even more dramatic. The squad leader was unconscious from blood loss, his injuries severe enough that improper handling would cause immediate death or permanent paralysis. Standard infantry first aid training would have been inadequate for injuries of this complexity. But Zara's hands moved with the confidence of someone who'd dealt with similar trauma situations before. She conducted a rapid medical assessment that revealed knowledge far beyond basic combat lifesaver training. Her examination of Rodriguez's spinal injuries was methodical and precise, identifying damage patterns that required specialized handling techniques. Most critically, she seemed to understand exactly how to stabilize his condition for transport without causing additional injury knowledge that regular soldiers simply didn't possess. Spinal injury at L2 and L3, possible internal bleeding, arterial damage in the left thigh, she called out to Chun, who was maintaining suppressive fire, while trying to understand how their supposedly incompetent medic had suddenly developed advanced trauma assessment capabilities. "I'm going to stabilize for transport, but I need continuous covering fire for the next 2 minutes." Her field treatment of Rodriguez's injuries was performed with surgical precision. She applied pressure to bleeding sites with techniques that minimized blood loss while maintaining spinal alignment. Her improvised splinting used materials from her kit in ways that suggested familiarity with advanced battlefield medicine protocols. Most impressively, she managed to stabilize Rodriguez's condition while under sustained enemy fire, working with steady hands that showed no evidence of the stress that typically affected soldiers during their first serious combat engagement. But the most shocking revelation came when Zara prepared to move Rodriguez to safety. The squad leader weighed 200 pounds of solid muscle, plus equipment that added another 40 pounds to his total weight. Standard military doctrine required multiple soldiers to safely evacuate casualties of his size, and everyone expected Zara to call for assistance that would expose additional soldiers to enemy fire. Instead, she positioned herself beside Rodriguez with movements that suggested she'd performed similar evacuations before. Her technique for lifting him was textbook special operations, fireman's carry modified for combat conditions that distributed weight efficiently while maintaining the injured soldier's spinal alignment. But more stunning than her technique was the apparent ease with which she lifted Rodriguez's considerable weight. The soldier who'd struggled to carry standard equipment loads during training exercises hoisted 240 pounds of wounded soldier and gear with a smooth, controlled movement that suggested reserves of strength that no one had suspected. Her positioning was perfect, her balance was stable, and when she began moving toward safety, she carried Rodriguez as if his weight was a manageable burden rather than an impossible load. "Jesus Christ," Williams whispered, maintaining covering fire while watching Zara navigate the return route with Rodriguez on her shoulders. How is she doing that? The return movement was even more tactically sophisticated than her initial approach. Carrying Rodriguez's weight, Zara couldn't use the same rapid evasive movements that had gotten her to his position. Instead, she employed techniques that seemed designed specifically for casualty evacuation under fire, careful route selection that maximized cover, timing that exploited gaps in enemy fire patterns, and most importantly, a movement pace that balanced speed with the stability necessary to prevent further injury to Rodriguez. Her physical endurance was equally remarkable. The soldier who'd consistently shown poor conditioning during training exercises was carrying more than twice her own body weight across difficult terrain while under sustained enemy fire, and her movement showed no signs of the fatigue that would have incapacitated most soldiers under similar circumstances. Private Chun, who'd been wounded in the initial ambush, found himself providing covering fire while trying to process the impossibility of what he was witnessing. "Hastings," he called out during a brief lull in enemy fire, "what's Blackthorne's actual background? Because what she's doing right now isn't possible for someone with standard infantry training." Hastings was asking himself the same question. Zara's tactical movement, her medical assessment capabilities, her apparent physical strength, and most importantly, her command presence under extreme stress, suggested training and experience that far exceeded anything in her official personnel file. She was performing like a special operations soldier, not a struggling infantry private. When Zara reached their defensive position, still carrying Rodriguez, her condition was another revelation. She was breathing heavily from exertion, but she wasn't exhausted in the way that such physical effort should have left her. Her hands were steady, her tactical awareness remained sharp, and when she set Rodriguez down, her medical treatment continued with the same precision that had characterized her initial assessment. "Rodriguez's condition is stable for transport," she reported to Hastings, "but he needs surgical intervention within 2 hours or the internal bleeding will kill him. We need immediate medical evacuation, and I can keep him alive during transport, but only if we can break contact with enemy forces and reach an extraction point." The tactical analysis was delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to making life-or-death medical assessments under combat conditions. But more than medical knowledge, Zara's report suggested leadership capabilities that regular privates didn't typically develop, especially privates who'd been struggling with basic military tasks for 8 months. Hastings found himself in the surreal position of receiving tactical and medical assessments from the soldier he'd been protecting, assessments that were more sophisticated and accurate than anything he could have provided himself. "Blackthorne," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and confusion. "Who the hell are you really?" Zara looked at him while continuing to monitor Rodriguez's condition, her hands working with practiced efficiency to maintain pressure on bleeding sites and ensure proper spinal alignment. For 8 months, she'd successfully convinced everyone that she was exactly what her personnel file indicated. Now, with Rodriguez's life depending on capabilities that she'd spent months hiding, that deception was no longer sustainable. "Right now," she replied, "I'm the soldier who's going to get Rodriguez to medical care and get the rest of you home alive. But we need to move fast, and we need to move smart, because the enemy has us outgunned and they're not going anywhere." Her tactical assessment was delivered with an authority that suggested military experience far beyond her apparent rank and training. What Hastings and the other soldiers didn't yet understand was that Private Zara Blackthorne had just revealed capabilities that would force them to reconsider not just her individual competence, but fundamental assumptions about leadership, physical capability, and what it meant to be ready for combat. The transformation was complete, but its implications were only beginning to become clear. The silence that followed Zara's tactical assessment was broken only by the distant crack of enemy rifles and Rodriguez's labored breathing. For several seconds, the surviving members of 3rd Platoon stared at their supposedly weakest soldier with expressions that ranged from bewilderment to something approaching awe. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything they'd witnessed in the past 10 minutes contradicted 8 months of consistent observations about Zara's limitations and capabilities. Corporal Hastings was the first to find his voice, though his words came slowly, as if he was still processing what he'd witnessed. "Blackthorne, I've been in the infantry for 6 years. What you just did, the tactical movement, the medical assessment, carrying Rodriguez like that's not standard training. That's not even advanced training for regular infantry." Private Chun, despite his shoulder wound, had been watching Zara's medical treatment of Rodriguez with particular attention. His own combat lifesaver training had given him enough knowledge to recognize that her techniques went far beyond anything they'd been taught. "The way you stabilized his spine, the pressure points you used to control bleeding, I've seen special forces medics work, and you're performing at that level. How is that possible?" Williams, still visibly shaken by the intensity of the firefight, was staring at Zara with an expression that suggested he was questioning his own perception of reality. 8 months, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 8 months of watching you struggle with basic equipment, finishing last in every physical exercise, asking questions about procedures that you apparently know better than our instructors. What the hell have you been hiding? Zara continued, monitoring Rodriguez's vital signs while the questions accumulated around her. His pulse was weak but steady, his breathing was shallow but regular, and the bleeding had been controlled well enough to buy them time. But time was still their most critical resource. His injuries required surgical intervention that was only available at a field hospital, and their current tactical situation made evacuation impossible until they could break contact with enemy forces. His blood pressure is dropping, she reported, deflecting attention from the increasingly uncomfortable questions about her background. The internal bleeding is controlled, but not stopped. We have maybe 90 minutes before shock becomes irreversible. And that's assuming no complications during transport. But Hastings wasn't ready to be deflected. His experience as a combat leader had taught him to recognize when soldiers were operating beyond their supposed capabilities, and what he'd witnessed from Zara suggested deception on a scale that raised serious questions about her real identity and training. Blackthorne, I'm asking you directly, What's your actual military background? Because privates don't develop the kind of capabilities you just demonstrated. The moment that Zara had been dreading for 8 months had finally arrived. The carefully constructed limitations that had protected her from command responsibility were no longer sustainable, and the questions about her real capabilities were becoming impossible to deflect. But Rodriguez was still in critical condition. Enemy forces were still maintaining their positions, and her fellow soldiers deserved honest answers about who they were really serving alongside. My background is more complicated than my personnel. File indicates, she said carefully, her hands still working to maintain Rodriguez's medical stability. But right now, what matters is getting all of us out of here alive. The tactical situation is still critical, and we need to focus on immediate survival rather than past credentials. Chun, despite his injury, pressed the issue with the persistence of someone who needed to understand what was happening around him. Complicated how? Because what you just did requires training that takes years to develop, special operations training. And your physical capabilities carrying Rodriguez, like that, suggests conditioning that we've never seen from you during any training exercise. Williams added his own observation, his voice carrying the strain of someone trying to reconcile contradictory evidence. The way you assessed the enemy positions, coordinated our covering fire, moved through the kill zone, that's advanced tactical knowledge. Not something you pick up from basic infantry training or weekend hunting trips with your father. Zara felt the familiar weight of scrutiny that she'd spent 8 months successfully avoiding. But the context was fundamentally different. Now these weren't administrative questions about her qualifications, but tactical assessments from soldiers whose lives had been saved by capabilities that she could no longer credibly deny possessing. I have training beyond what my current rank suggests, she admitted, the words coming reluctantly but carrying the weight of honesty that the situation demanded. Training that I'd hoped never to use again. But Rodriguez was dying, and conventional infantry tactics weren't adequate for the situation we faced. Hastings leaned forward, his expression intense with the need to understand the tactical resources available to his unit. What kind of training? And why is someone with advanced military capabilities serving as a private in regular infantry? The questions were logical and necessary, but answering them honestly would require Zara to acknowledge the psychological trauma that had driven her to abandon her previous military career. More importantly, it would require her to accept that her fellow soldiers now understood she possessed leadership capabilities that they would inevitably expect her to use. Special operations, she said simply, the admission carrying implications that would fundamentally change how 3rd Platoon understood their tactical capabilities and command structure. And I'm serving as a private because I requested demotion after circumstances that made me believe I was unsuited for leadership responsibilities. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence, forcing each soldier to reconsider not just their assessment of Zara's individual capabilities, but their understanding of their unit's actual combat potential. They'd been thinking of themselves as a standard infantry patrol with limited tactical options. Suddenly they were operating alongside someone whose training and experience exceeded that of most officers they'd served under. Chun's reaction was immediate and practical. If you have special operations training, then you understand tactical options that we don't. What's our best chance of getting Rodriguez to medical care and breaking contact with enemy forces? Williams added his own tactical concern. How do we coordinate evacuation when our radio equipment is compromised and the enemy has superior positions? But it was Hastings who asked the question that would define their immediate future. Blackthorne, or whoever you really are you willing to take tactical command of this situation? Because standard infantry doctrine isn't working, and if you have training that can get us out of here alive, we need you to use it. The request was exactly what Zara had been avoiding for 8 months, formal acknowledgement of leadership, capabilities that would make her responsible for tactical decisions that could result in casualties. But Rodriguez's condition was deteriorating. Enemy forces were maintaining pressure that would eventually overwhelm their defensive capabilities, and her fellow soldiers were explicitly asking her to accept responsibility for their survival. "My name is Zara Blackthorne," she said, her voice carrying a note of authority that none of them had heard before. "I hold the rank of captain in the United States Army Special Operations Command, currently serving under administrative reduction to private for personal reasons. And yes, I'll take tactical command if that's what's necessary to get Rodriguez medical attention and bring the rest of you home alive." The transformation was complete. Private Zara Blackthorne, the struggling infantry soldier, had been replaced by Captain Blackthorne, Special Operations Officer. With all the capabilities and responsibilities that the revelation entailed, what remained to be seen was whether accepting command responsibility again would allow her to save her fellow soldiers, or whether the psychological trauma that had driven her from special operations would reassert itself at the worst possible moment. The weight of command settled around Zara's shoulders with a familiarity that was both comforting and terrifying. For 8 months, she'd successfully avoided the crushing responsibility of making tactical decisions that could result in casualties. But Rodriguez's deteriorating condition and the increasingly desperate tactical situation left no room for the psychological luxury of self-protection. Her fellow soldiers were looking to her for leadership that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophic failure, and their trust demanded that she set aside her personal trauma to function as the officer she'd once been. "Hastings, what's our ammunition status across all weapon systems?" she asked, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to coordinating complex tactical operations under extreme pressure. The transition from struggling private to commanding officer was jarring for the other soldiers, but the immediate tactical demands left little time for adjustment. Approximately 400 rounds for the SAW, maybe 600 rounds of rifle ammunition distributed across 4 weapons, Hastings reported, his own voice reflecting the cognitive dissonance of receiving orders from someone he'd been protecting just hours earlier. Chun's shoulder wound is affecting his ability to maintain sustained fire, and Rodriguez obviously can't contribute to our defensive capabilities. Zara processed the information while simultaneously monitoring Rodriguez's medical condition and conducting a tactical assessment of their defensive position. Her special operations training had included extensive scenarios involving small unit operations with limited resources and compromised communications, exactly the situation they currently faced. But the psychological pressure of command responsibility was already beginning to affect her concentration in ways that she'd hoped 8 months of psychological distance had resolved. "Chun, can you maintain suppressive fire for another 10 minutes, or do we need to redistribute the SAW to someone else?" Her question carried the weight of command decisions that would affect their survival chances, and she felt the familiar anxiety that came with being responsible for other soldiers' lives. "I can handle it," Chun replied, though his pale complexion and the increasing amount of blood soaking through his bandages suggested that his condition was more serious than he was admitting. "But if we're planning movement, we need to do it soon. I'm not going to be effective much longer." Williams added his own tactical concern. "The enemy has been probing our position for the past 5 minutes. They're testing our response times and ammunition expenditure. That suggests they're planning an assault rather than maintaining the siege indefinitely." Zara's tactical analysis confirmed Williams' assessment, but it also revealed opportunities that regular infantry training wouldn't have identified. The enemy's probing attacks had revealed their positioning and coordination patterns, information that could be exploited by someone with advanced tactical knowledge. More importantly, their focus on preparing for an assault had created brief windows when their observation of potential escape routes was reduced. "Rodriguez's condition is stable for the next hour, but no longer," she reported while checking his vital signs and adjusting his medical stabilization. Internal bleeding is controlled but continuing at a rate that will become critical without surgical intervention. We need to reach the evacuation point at grid reference 314,159 within 45 minutes, or medical complications will make transport impossible. The grid reference she'd mentioned was 2 miles away across terrain that would challenge healthy soldiers under normal circumstances. With Rodriguez requiring evacuation and Chun wounded, their movement would be significantly slower than standard patrol pace. Most critically, a route to the evacuation point traversed terrain that provided multiple opportunities for enemy ambush, meaning that breaking contact from their current position would only expose them to additional tactical challenges. "Ma'am," Hastings said, the formal address reflecting his recognition of Zara's revealed rank and capabilities. "How do you propose we cover 2 miles of hostile terrain while carrying Rodriguez and maintaining tactical security with reduced personnel?" The question struck directly at the heart of Zara's psychological trauma. During Operation Silent Thunder, similar tactical challenges had resulted in casualties that haunted her for months afterward. The memory of Torres dying while following her orders, of Kim succumbing to injuries sustained during a mission she'd planned, created a paralyzing anxiety about making command decisions that could result in similar outcomes. But Rodriguez's medical condition and the deteriorating tactical situation left no alternative to assuming command responsibility. The other soldiers lacked the training necessary to coordinate the kind of complex tactical movement that their situation required, and delay would only worsen their chances of successful evacuation. "We're going to use a technique called leapfrog movement," she explained, forcing herself to focus on tactical solutions rather than psychological concerns. "Chun and Williams will provide overwatch while Hastings and I move Rodriguez to the first checkpoint. Then Hastings maintains security, while I return to escort Chun and Williams to our position. It's slower than standard movement, but it provides continuous cover for the wounded while maintaining tactical security." Williams looked skeptical about the plan's feasibility. "That's going to take hours and will be exposed to enemy observation during every movement phase. How do we prevent them from repositioning to intercept us at vulnerable points along the route?" Zara's response revealed tactical knowledge that went far beyond standard infantry training. "The enemy positions are coordinated but not mobile. Their weapon systems are positioned for sustained fire rather than rapid repositioning, and their ammunition supplies suggest they're planning to maintain their current positions rather than pursue us aggressively. If we time our movement correctly and use deception techniques to mask our actual route, we can reach the evacuation point before they can coordinate an effective pursuit." The tactical analysis was sophisticated and accurate, but Hastings noticed something troubling in Zara's demeanor. Despite her apparent confidence and tactical competence, he could see signs of stress that went beyond the normal pressure of combat leadership. Her hands occasionally trembled when she thought no one was observing. Her breathing sometimes became irregular during quiet moments, and her eyes carried the weight of someone struggling with psychological burdens that extended beyond their immediate tactical situation. "Captain," he said carefully, using her revealed rank deliberately, "are you certain you're ready to coordinate this operation? Because if there are factors affecting your judgment, we need to know before we commit to a plan that puts everyone at risk." The question was both respectful and necessary, reflecting Hastings' recognition that leadership under combat conditions required psychological stability as well as tactical competence. But it also forced Zara to confront the reality that her fellow soldiers had noticed the psychological stress that command responsibility was creating. "I'm functional," she replied, the words carrying more honesty than she'd intended. "My training and experience are adequate for this situation, and Rodriguez's medical condition doesn't allow for alternative leadership options. But you're right to be concerned about command stress. It's a factor that could affect tactical decision-making." Chun, despite his injury, offered support that reflected the changing dynamics within their unit. "Ma'am, we trust your tactical judgment based on what you've already demonstrated. If you need anything from us to support your decision-making, you just need to ask." Williams added his own acknowledgement of her leadership. "Whatever psychological factors you're dealing with, they haven't affected your performance so far. Rodriguez is alive because of decisions you made under extreme pressure, and that gives us confidence in your ability to get us through the evacuation." The expressions of trust and confidence were both reassuring and terrifying for Zara. Represented exactly the kind of faith that soldiers had placed in her during Operation Silent Thunder, faith that she'd failed to justify when her tactical decisions had resulted in casualties that better leadership might have prevented. But Rodriguez's condition was continuing to deteriorate. Enemy forces were maintaining pressure that would eventually overwhelm their defensive capabilities, and her fellow soldiers were explicitly trusting her with their survival. The psychological burden of command responsibility was already affecting her concentration and decision-making, but the tactical situation left no alternative to accepting leadership that could save lives or result in catastrophic failure. "Prepare for movement in 5 minutes," she ordered, her voice carrying the authority of special operations training, despite the psychological stress that was already beginning to undermine her confidence. "We're going to bring everyone home alive, but it's going to require precise coordination and trust in tactical decisions that might seem counterintuitive." What remained to be seen was whether Captain Zara Blackthorne could overcome the psychological trauma that had destroyed her previous military career long enough to save the soldiers who were trusting her with their lives. The evacuation that followed was a masterclass in special operations tactics, executed under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Over the next 3 hours, Captain Zara Blackthorne systematically dismantled every assumption her fellow soldiers had held about tactical movement, combat leadership, and what it meant to bring wounded soldiers home from hostile territory. What they witnessed was the difference between standard infantry training and the kind of specialized capabilities that defined elite military units. The leapfrog movement technique that Zara coordinated was flawlessly executed despite the psychological pressure that she was clearly struggling to manage. Her tactical decisions were precise and adaptive, adjusting to changing enemy patterns and terrain challenges with the kind of flexibility that came from years of special operations experience. Most importantly, her coordination of their movement prioritized Rodriguez's medical stability, while maintaining security protocols that kept the entire unit alive, despite overwhelming tactical disadvantages. Carrying Rodriguez across 2 miles of hostile terrain while coordinating the movement of wounded soldiers and maintaining tactical security should have been impossible for any individual soldier. But Zara's physical conditioning, tactical knowledge, and leadership capabilities proved adequate for challenges that would have overwhelmed conventional infantry approaches. Her load-bearing techniques allowed her to carry Rodriguez's weight without compromising her own tactical effectiveness, and her endurance capabilities sustained her performance across distances that should have left her exhausted. When they finally reached the evacuation point at grid reference 314,159, Rodriguez was still alive and stable enough for immediate medical helicopter transport. Shun's shoulder wound had been properly treated during movement halts, and Williams had emerged from the experience with a fundamentally changed understanding of what elite military training could accomplish under extreme conditions. Most critically, every member of 3rd Platoon had survived an encounter that could easily have resulted in multiple casualties or complete unit loss. The medical helicopter crew that evacuated Rodriguez commented on the quality of field treatment he'd received, noting that his stabilization was performed with techniques that exceeded standard combat lifesaver training. The flight medic specifically asked Zara about her medical background, recognizing capabilities that suggested formal trauma medicine education rather than basic military first aid training. "Whoever treated this soldier saved his life," the flight medic told Hastings as they prepared Rodriguez for transport. The spinal stabilization and bleeding control were performed perfectly, and the evacuation technique maintained his condition. Better than most hospital transfers. Your unit's medic has training that goes way beyond standard qualifications. But for Zara, the successful evacuation represented something more complex than tactical accomplishment. She'd proven to herself that her special operations capabilities remained intact despite 8 months of deliberate suppression. And more importantly, she demonstrated that command responsibility didn't inevitably result in casualties when applied with appropriate training and experience. The psychological trauma from Operation Silent Thunder hadn't disappeared, but it had been balanced by evidence that her leadership could save lives rather than cost them. 3 weeks after the evacuation, Rodriguez returned to Forward Operating Base Thunderclap with a full recovery that his doctors attributed directly to the quality of battlefield treatment and evacuation he'd received. His first action was to request a private meeting with the soldier who'd saved his life, though by then everyone at the base understood that Private Zara Blackthorne was considerably more than her personnel file had indicated. "Captain," he said, using her revealed rank despite her continued service as a private, "I've been thinking about what happened during that patrol. About the tactical decisions you made and the capabilities you demonstrated. I need to understand why someone with your qualifications and experience was serving in my squad as a regular infantry soldier." Zara met his eyes with the kind of direct honesty that their shared experience had earned. "I was hiding from responsibility that I wasn't psychologically prepared to handle. Command decisions that could result in casualties. The weight of being responsible for other soldiers' lives in situations where tactical mistakes could get people killed." Rodriguez nodded slowly, his expression reflecting understanding that came from his own years of military leadership. "But you handled command responsibility during our evacuation flawlessly. Your tactical decisions saved my life and brought everyone home safely. What changed between your previous service and that day?" The question required Zara to confront psychological growth that she was only beginning to understand herself. "Nothing changed about the responsibility or the potential consequences of command decisions. But I learned that avoiding responsibility doesn't eliminate the risk to other soldiers. It just ensures that when crisis situations arise, they won't have access to the best leadership available." Their conversation was interrupted by Hastings, Chun, and Williams, who'd requested permission to speak with their former squad mate about her future assignment plans. Word had spread throughout Delta Company about the capabilities that Private Blackthorne had revealed, and several officers had expressed interest in having her transferred to positions that would utilize her actual qualifications rather than her official rank. "Ma'am," Hastings said, "Colonel Harrison has been asking about your interest in returning to special operations or accepting assignment as a tactical instructor. Your performance during our evacuation has generated recommendations from officers who understand the kind of training and experience you demonstrated." Zara looked at the soldiers who'd shared the most intense combat experience of their military careers, recognizing that their survival had created bonds that transcended normal unit relationships. But she also understood that accepting assignments that matched her actual capabilities would require her to abandon the psychological protection that service as a regular soldier had provided. "I'm considering options that would allow me to use my training while maintaining the kind of service that I'm psychologically comfortable with," she replied carefully. "Leadership positions that involve training and development rather than direct combat command responsibility." Chun offered his own perspective as someone who'd witnessed her capabilities under extreme pressure. "Whatever position you accept, you should know that what you did for us changed how we understand leadership and tactical capability. You proved that real strength isn't about physical size or official rank. It's about having the skills and courage to act when other people's lives depend on your decisions." Williams added his assessment, You showed us what it means to be ready for situations that training can't fully prepare you for. And more importantly, you demonstrated that past failures don't define future capabilities if you're willing to accept responsibility when it matters. 6 months later, Captain Zara Blackthorne was assigned as a senior instructor at the Army's Advanced Individual Training Facility, where she taught tactical medicine and personnel recovery techniques to soldiers preparing for combat deployments. Her curriculum emphasized the kind of advanced capabilities that had saved Rodriguez's life, but her teaching methods reflected hard-earned understanding of how psychological factors affected performance under extreme stress. She never returned to direct combat command, but her training programs produced soldiers whose tactical capabilities exceeded standard infantry preparation by significant margins. Her students learned not just technical skills, but the psychological resilience necessary to perform effectively when standard procedures proved inadequate for the situations they faced. The woman who'd hidden her capabilities for 8 months had found a way to use her training without carrying the crushing responsibility that had ended her previous career. She'd learned that strength wasn't about avoiding responsibility, but about accepting it in ways that maximize her ability to help other soldiers while maintaining her own psychological stability. Rodriguez, who'd fully recovered from his injuries, often visited her training sessions when his duties allowed. He'd tell her students about the day when someone they might have underestimated had saved his life through capabilities that exceeded anything they'd expected, and how that experience had taught him never to assume that official qualifications represented the full measure of any soldier's potential. And sometimes, when her students asked about the difference between official training and real-world application, Zara would tell them about a patrol in the Kandohar Mountains where tactical assumptions had proven inadequate, and where survival had required capabilities that couldn't be measured by standard assessments or reflected in personnel files. The soldier who'd been too fragile for combat had become living proof that true strength often emerged from unexpected sources, and that the most important victories were sometimes won by those who'd learned to overcome their own limitations rather than those who'd never faced them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.